In the winter of 1219, deep in the burning remains of a Khwarezmian village, a young woman stood motionless as Mongol soldiers pulled her from the rubble. Her trembling hands still clutched the body of her baby brother. Behind her, flames devoured the only home she had ever known. Her name was Syra, just 15, and in a few moments she would learn what thousands before her already knew. When the Mongol army arrived, the women did not simply lose their freedom, they lost their entire identity. She didn't scream. None of them did anymore. Every village the Mongols crossed had already whispered the same terrifying warning. Their arrows kill men, but their breeding system kills nations. To the Mongols, women weren't prisoners, they were units. Classified, processed, and absorbed into a machine far more terrifying than any battlefield. Across Eurasia, tens of thousands of captured women were fed into a cold system designed with mathematical precision, a system where age, beauty, body type, fertility, and ancestry were recorded like livestock, a system where motherhood wasn't sacred, it was weaponized. This is the story of what Genghis Khan truly did to enemy wives, and why its consequences still echo in the bloodlines of millions alive today. When a Mongol army approached the walls of any city, its people already knew their fate was sealed, yet nothing could prepare the women for what came next. Because the Mongols never marched blindly or attacked impulsively, their invasions were constructed through intelligence networks that moved months ahead of the cavalry, gathering information with uncanny precision about every tribe, every clan, every household, and especially every woman of reproductive age whose body could be used as a biological resource after the fighting ended. Once the gates fell and the soldiers flooded in, chaos erupted around the men. But for the women, the terror took a much colder form, because Mongol scribes, silent figures riding behind the warriors, would immediately begin cataloging them based on age, appearance, ancestry, physical structure, and perceived fertility, turning human beings into entries in a ledger. Women between 14 and 30 were herded into a separate zone, not because they were being protected, but because they were classified as primary reproducers, an official term used within the Mongol administrative system that identified which captives would be fed into the reproductive machinery of the empire. These women were not comforted, reassured, or treated as victims. They were assessed with the same detachment used to evaluate horses, livestock, or military supplies. The wives of enemy leaders suffered an even worse fate, because their capture carried symbolic meaning that lived longer than any battlefield victory. Taking the wife of a defeated ruler shattered the morale of his people and destroyed the bloodline that could have produced future resistance. These wives, often noble women raised in privilege and dignity, were stripped of status and presented to Mongol officers as trophies of psychological warfare. Their identity mattered only in how it benefited the empire. Their culture, refinement, and lineage were irrelevant unless it strengthened the genetic goals of the conquerors. The Mongols believed that the womb was a weapon, and by absorbing the wives of powerful men into their reproductive system, they ensured that children produced from those women would no longer belong to the fallen nation but to the empire growing under Genghis Khan's command. Once initial sorting ended, the women were taken to temporary holding areas known as transition enclosures, where guards, physicians, and administrators worked together like parts of a single, merciless machine. Here, women underwent forced examinations to determine health and reproductive potential, and no amount of crying or pleading changed their fate, because the Mongols did not see these acts as cruelty. They saw them as logistical necessities. Enemy wives who belonged to respected lineages were assigned directly to high-ranking Mongol officers, while others were sent to long-distance caravans that followed the army for months at a time. These caravans were not mere chains of captives. They were rolling reproductive facilities designed to reshape entire populations. The women quickly understood that what Genghis Khan did to enemy wives was not random brutality, but a deliberate system that replaced family, culture, and future with a single horrific truth. From the moment the Mongols entered the city, a woman no longer belonged to her people or herself. She belonged to the empire's bloodline, as the Mongol armies pushed deeper into foreign lands. The system that awaited captured women evolved into something far more chilling than simple enslavement. Because the caravans that trailed behind the soldiers were not random chains of prisoners, but highly structured human processing units designed to transform reproduction into a state-controlled weapon. And every woman who entered them became part of a living machine that operated with ruthless consistency. where pregnancy cycles were measured like military timetables and newborns were evaluated with the same precision used to inspect war horses. Inside these caravans, thousands of women were confined in vast moving camps, divided into sections such as initial intake, early pregnancy, late pregnancy, postpartum recovery, and reassignment, with each section monitored by guards, scribes, and physicians who viewed the captives not as individuals but as biological assets whose worth depended entirely on their reproductive output. Mongol physicians, many of whom had studied in conquered cities or absorbed knowledge from Chinese and Persian medical traditions, developed crude but deliberate techniques to manipulate the fertility of these women, feeding them herbal mixtures to regulate ovulation, adjusting their diets to increase stamina during pregnancy, and even performing painful experiments intended to correct what they considered faulty wombs. Every woman was inspected regularly, often in brutal and humiliating examinations that ignored pain and dignity, because the Mongols believed that a woman's value lay not in her voice or identity, but in her capacity to produce children who could expand the empire's bloodline. Enemy wives, especially those belonging to noble families or ruling clans, were placed at the top of this biological hierarchy, not out of mercy but because their lineage held political value for the emerging Mongol elite. Children born from influential bloodlines could be raised as future governors, military officers, or loyal intermediaries within newly conquered regions, creating a generation of Mongol-aligned offspring who carried the prestige of two worlds. These noble women received slightly better food, cleaner water, and modest protections. But such gestures were merely strategic investments, because their well-being mattered only to the extent that it improved the likelihood of producing healthy heirs. Many enemy wives attempted resistance through starvation, injury, or attempts to end pregnancies. But the Mongols anticipated these acts long before they happened. Guards force-fed starving women through cloth funnels, restrained those who tried to harm themselves, and punished entire groups when a single woman attempted escape, turning suffering into a communal deterrent. The emotional weight inside these caravans grew unbearable as women realized that grief held no meaning in a system that viewed them as moving wombs rather than human beings. When children were born, the cruelest part of the system began, because newborns were sorted with shocking detachment. Infants displaying strong Mongol features were immediately removed from their mothers and raised in Mongol households, where they would grow without memory of their original culture, while babies who did not meet the empire's genetic expectations simply disappeared, recorded in cold administrative language as unviable, leaving the mothers to mourn in silence while being prepared for the next cycle of forced reproduction. This relentless process taught every captive woman, especially enemy wives, the devastating truth that in Genghis Khan's empire, motherhood was not a sacred bond, but a state-controlled function, and their bodies had become the battleground on which the future of entire nations was being rewritten in the most terrifying way imaginable. Among all the women forced into the Mongol reproductive system, none endured a fate more psychologically devastating than the enemy wives of rulers, tribal chiefs, and noble bloodlines, because their capture carried a symbolic weight that reached far beyond the physical suffering inflicted on them. And the Mongols understood with chilling clarity that breaking these women meant breaking the future of entire nations, which is why enemy wives were separated from the general caravans and placed into specialized compounds where every minute of their existence was controlled, monitored, and weaponized to ensure the complete destruction of their former identity. These women, many of whom had grown up surrounded by respect, luxury, and ceremonial duties, suddenly found themselves catalogued like livestock and subjected to a ritualized humiliation designed to erase both their personal dignity and the political significance of their lineage. Because the Mongols believed that the most effective way to annihilate a rival dynasty was not to kill its men, but to take its women, impregnate them, and raise their children as Mongols, thereby dissolving centuries of heritage within a single generation. The psychological warfare inflicted upon enemy wives was more calculated than any physical torture, as Mongol officers ensured that these women witnessed the collapse of everything they had once anchored their identity in. Their families scattered, their people enslaved, their cultural traditions banned, and their children, if born with Mongol features, taken from their arms to be raised by strangers who would teach them to despise the very nations their mothers came from. Inside these compounds, enemy wives lived in a controlled nightmare where every expression, every refusal, every tear was observed by guards trained not only in discipline, but in the psychological mechanisms of domination. And the Mongols displayed a disturbing expertise in breaking the will of high-born women by using isolation, sleep deprivation, strategic degradation, and forced bonding with officers to ensure emotional dependency. These wives were required to perform tasks designed to invert their former social status, such as preparing the meals of low-ranking soldiers or washing the garments of Mongol concubines, because the Mongols believed that stripping a noblewoman of her symbolic authority was as important as exploiting her reproductive potential. In the rare moments when these women attempted resistance, whether through refusal to eat, attempts to injure themselves, or efforts to sabotage pregnancies, the Mongols responded not with impulsive violence, but with premeditated protocols developed to neutralize each form of defiance. Starving women were force-fed until they lost the ability to resist, self-inflicted wounds were treated only to preserve reproductive function, and women who tried to end their pregnancies were placed under constant surveillance, often restrained at night and guarded in shifts by soldiers ordered to maintain their fertility at all costs. For enemy wives who succeeded in giving birth, the agony deepened even further, because the moment they delivered their child, Mongol administrators examined the infant with cold detachment, checking facial structure, skull shape, muscle tone, and bone alignment to determine whether the baby could be raised as a Mongol, and if the infant passed these evaluations, the mother's arms were emptied before she could even hold the child long enough to memorize its features, while babies deemed unfit vanished into the shadows of the camp without explanation. This system inflicted a form of suffering that words cannot fully capture, because enemy wives carried children who were both theirs and not theirs, born from their bodies yet claimed entirely by the empire. And the realization that every birth strengthened the bloodline of their conquerors while severing their remaining connection to their own identity created a psychological wound that consumed them more completely than any physical pain. It was in this unbearable intersection of motherhood, captivity, and erasure that the true horror of what Genghis Khan did to enemy wives revealed itself, because their suffering was not a byproduct of war, but a deliberate strategy designed to rewrite the lineage of nations through the destruction of the women who once held those lineages together. As the Mongol Empire expanded from the frozen rivers of Siberia to the burning sands of Persia and the walled kingdoms of China, the reproductive machine trailing behind the army grew so vast and so meticulously organized that it resembled a second shadow empire moving in parallel to the military conquests, because the caravans of captive women stretched for miles across the steppe, forming an unbroken line of suffering bodies whose footsteps created a rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat for the empire's biological ambitions. And every region the Mongols conquered added thousands more women into the system, feeding it with the diversity of Eurasia in a way that no invasion before or after would ever replicate. These caravans were divided into complex administrative zones, some dedicated to newly captured women undergoing initial classification, others for women in early pregnancy, others for late pregnancy, others for nursing mothers, and still others for those whose reproductive capacity was being reevaluated. And each zone had its own scribes, physicians, herbalists, guards, and enforcers who operated like the staff of an enormous, brutal institution that existed solely to convert human lives into genetic currency. The logistics behind these caravans were staggering. Supply stations were built along the empire's major routes for the explicit purpose of evaluating and sorting women. Field hospitals were erected not for healing in a humane sense, but to maintain reproductive output, and specialized wagons called birthing wagons traveled with the armies to ensure that no woman escaped the cycle of conception, pregnancy, and forced motherhood, even in the middle of long-distance marches where exhaustion killed men, but somehow spared wombs. The administrators refused to lose. The scale of the operation defied comprehension, because by the early 13th century, Mongol records described more than 100,000 captive women moving in coordinated formations behind the central army groups, and later chroniclers wrote that if you stood along the caravan routes, you could see the procession of women for an entire day without witnessing its end. Yet the true horror was not in the sheer number of captives, but in how the system erased individuality so completely that thousands of women, each with their own families, languages, histories, and dreams, became nothing more than identification codes inked on their wrists or burned into their skin with heated metal, reducing human identity to. Even the children produced by this machine were not spared the cold arithmetic of the empire, because newborns were inspected at birth and removed from their mothers if they matched Mongol physical traits, while infants who did not pass the evaluation vanished from the records entirely, leaving behind nothing but grief buried under enforced silence. The enemy wives within these caravans faced a magnitude of despair that few humans can comprehend, because they understood more clearly than anyone that the scale of the system meant there was no possibility of rescue, rebellion, or even remembrance. Their nations were collapsing, their families were dead or enslaved, and their children, if allowed to live, would be raised to despise the people they themselves came from, creating a future in which even survival became a cruel irony. The Mongols had not only conquered land, they had conquered time itself, shaping future generations by rewriting the bloodline of entire regions, and the continental scale of this reproductive bureaucracy ensured that the horror inflicted on enemy wives did not end with their bodies, but continued in the genetic legacy that marched forward long after their voices were silenced. In this sprawling machinery of conquest, no battlefield victory was as effective as the system that turned women into biological extensions of the empire, and as the caravans expanded with each campaign, the Mongol conquest transformed from a war of swords into a war of wombs, a dark strategy that consumed millions and left behind an echo of suffering woven into the DNA of countless people alive today. As the years passed and the Mongol Empire reached its zenith, the system that consumed enemy wives evolved into something so entrenched within the fabric of Mongol expansion that it no longer resembled a wartime atrocity, but an institutionalized mechanism of empire building, whose consequences stretched far beyond the women who suffered within it. Because long after the battles ended and the fires of conquest died, the true imprint of this machinery continued through the children who were born into it, many of whom carried Mongol features, Mongol names, and Mongol loyalties, despite having mothers from dozens of conquered cultures scattered across Eurasia. And for the women who endured the system, especially enemy wives whose lineage once symbolized the strength of kingdoms, the torment remained long after their bodies had been forced into submission, because every birth, every child taken from their arms, every ritual of separation and erasure carved a deeper wound that extended not only across their own lifetimes, but across the memory of entire civilizations that lost daughters, bloodlines, and cultural identity to an empire that understood more clearly than any conqueror before them that controlling women meant controlling the future. Archaeological discoveries from Central Asia, Persia, and the steppes reveal mass graves containing young women and children buried without ritual or markers, their bones bearing signs of malnutrition, forced marches, untreated fractures, and the unmistakable trauma of being transported across thousands of miles under conditions designed not to preserve their lives but to preserve their reproductive capacity. And the presence of children in these graves, many of them infants or toddlers, confirms that the caravans were not temporary or isolated, but a continuous institution whose victims never returned home and whose suffering was erased from official Mongol records that glorified military victories. What makes this legacy even more haunting is the scientific confirmation that emerged centuries later when geneticists analyzing Y chromosome patterns discovered that nearly 16 million men alive today descend directly from Genghis Khan or his immediate family, a staggering statistic that cannot be explained by ordinary reproduction or voluntary unions, but instead reflects the enormous scale of reproductive domination embedded in the empire's strategies. And this genetic echo, stretching across Mongolia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and even parts of Eastern Europe, represents not only the biological success of the Mongol system, but also the disappearance. For enemy wives, this knowledge would have been the cruelest truth imaginable, because it meant that every attempt to preserve their lineage, every whispered name, every secret lullaby, every desperate effort to protect a child, was ultimately swallowed by an empire that measured victory not through monuments or maps, but through the children who carried its blood into future generations. The emotional resistance of these women, however, left faint but persistent traces that survive even when historical records remain silent, because travelers, poets, and chroniclers from conquered regions occasionally mention the whispered songs, coded gestures, and hidden rituals that women used to remember who they were before their identities were stripped away. And these small rebellions, though powerless against the machinery of conquest, represent some of the only surviving fragments of the millions of women whose voices were deliberately excluded from official chronicles. In the end, the legacy of what Genghis Khan did to enemy wives is not confined to the distant past. It lives in the bones unearthed from ancient graves, in the genetic patterns that stretch across continents, in the cultural silences that still haunt regions shaped by Mongol domination, and in the quiet, unrecorded suffering of women whose names were erased but whose stolen futures continue to ripple through history. Their stories remind us that empires are not built only by soldiers winning battles on open fields, but by systems that quietly break mothers, reshape bloodlines, and rewrite the destiny of nations through methods so calculated, so vast, and so terrifying that the world still feels their impact centuries later.